Howdy, students. In the previous videos, I've described how the central part of a mitigation policy is putting a price on carbon emissions, either through a carbon tax or through a cap and trade. In this video, we'll talk more about how exactly you implement this. Let's begin by talking about how these policies would be implemented. A carbon tax would be applied when fossil fuels were extracted from the ground, at the wellhead or at the mine. This is the easiest place to apply it because there aren't that many wells and mines, and we could use existing infrastructure that monitors production. Similarly, for a cap and trade system, a permit would have to be applied when the fossil fuels were removed from the ground. The price of either the tax or the permit would then increase the price of fossil fuels, and that would ripple through the economy, increasing the cost of goods and services in proportion to how much carbon is emitted in their production. So, for example, electricity generated by coal would see a large price increase because coal produces a lot of carbon emissions per joule of energy produced. Goods and services produced using coal-fired energy would also see price increases. But electricity generated by wind and solar would not see an increase, nor would anything produced using wind and solar energy. In this way, a price on carbon changes the economics of energy. In response to the increase in prices of fossil fuel energy, individual actors in the economy will make decisions about how to respond. Some consumers may continue to use fossil fuel, but may adopt more efficient processes in order to use less energy. Others will switch to renewable energy. This is why carbon tax and cap and trade policies are referred to as market-based approaches. They do not tell anyone what to do, but just give the markets a price signal and then let each individual actor decide what they want to do. Finally, putting a price on carbon will spur innovation. Once people know that emissions of carbon to the atmosphere are no longer free, the private sector will invest huge resources in finding new ways to do the things we want to do without emitting carbon to the atmosphere. To understand how innovation works, here are the marginal costs of the plant we've discussed a few times previously. In response to a $4 per ton carbon tax, the plant will reduce emissions by 4 units. Now, imagine that innovation means it becomes cheaper to reduce emissions. In this framework, innovation is reducing the marginal costs of emissions reductions. So now, with lower marginal costs, the plant will reduce emissions by 5 units in response to a $4 per ton carbon tax. Thus, innovation allows us to make bigger reductions more cheaply. If history is any guide, innovation will be extremely rapid, and we will discover that reducing emissions was actually not that hard or expensive. Fingers crossed. In order to stabilize the climate, net emissions have to drop to 0. The way to do this with a carbon tax is to ramp up the tax rate over time. The tax might start at $40 per ton today, but it would rise a few percent per year. It may eventually reach very high values in a century or so. This would drive emissions to 0 over that same time period. Under a cap and trade system, the government determines emissions directly through the number of permits issued. So if the government wants emissions to go to 0, then the government just issues fewer and fewer permits every year until they reach the point where they're issuing no permits. As fewer and fewer permits are issued, the price of the permits will go up, and this will cause most emitters to choose to reduce emissions rather than pay for permits. One of the biggest issues with putting a price on carbon has to do with revenue generation. A carbon tax generates an enormous amount of money for the government. A cap and trade system does the same thing as long as the permits are auctioned rather than given away for free. So a good policy should specify what to do with all of this revenue. One popular idea is to simply divide the revenue up and cut each person a check. This idea, sometimes referred to as cap and dividend, is revenue neutral since the government doesn't keep any of the revenue. The idea behind this approach is that people won't object to taxing emissions if the revenue is immediately returned to the people. Other ideas would be to use the revenue to reduce other taxes, such as those on labor or capital. Governments could also use the money for research and development of renewable energy or other worthwhile activities, such as retraining people who lost their jobs because of the carbon tax, like coal miners. Or these approaches could be combined, with some money being refunded, some being used to reduce taxes, and the rest being used to achieve other policy objectives. Now we turn to one of the other issues that has to be specified in any policy: how to deal with offsets. To understand offsets, imagine that you own a plant that emits 50 tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. But you also own a forest that pulls 50 tons of carbon out of the atmosphere during the year. Now imagine there's a carbon tax of, say, $40 per ton. How much would you owe? Do you pay on the emissions of the plant alone, or do you get credit for the fact that the forest is absorbing carbon? If you do, you might argue you owe no tax because the plant's emissions are entirely canceled by the carbon uptake by the forest. Actions that reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you can think of these as negative emissions, are often referred to as offsets. In this case, the forest is the offset. They are called offsets because, if allowed, emitters can use them to offset their greenhouse gas emissions, thereby reducing their carbon tax. From the physics standpoint, there's no difference to the climate system between no emissions and emitting 1 ton while at the same time removing 1 ton via an offsetting mechanism. So that would argue that offsets should reduce your carbon tax burden. Offsets also make sense from an efficiency standpoint. In much the same way that carbon tax and cap-and-trade systems are efficient because they encourage the lowest marginal cost emitters to make the reductions, offsets provide options in exactly how emissions are reduced. It may be cheaper, for example, for a coal-fired power plant to offset emissions by planting trees than it would be for it to capture the carbon produced in coal combustion. This is known as flexibility in an emissions reduction policy. Because they provide flexibility, offsets would be expected to lower the cost of reaching any specified emissions target. But there are difficulties with offsets. First, they're difficult to verify. For example, it is hard to measure how much carbon a forest is absorbing. Without accurate measurements, you run the big risk of fraud in offsets, whereby people overstate the amount of carbon some processes are removing from the atmosphere in order to derive more benefits than they deserve. Second, for an offset to be effective, the carbon being removed must stay out of the atmosphere for a very long time. But what happens if, say, a forest absorbs carbon for 5 years, but then a fire roars through the forest, releasing it all back into the atmosphere? In that case, the offsets would have had little benefit to the climate system. So we would have wasted all the value we gave for the carbon absorbed before the fire. Thus, one must verify the stability of any offsets to verify they are really and permanently removing carbon from the atmosphere. Another type of offset occurs when an emitter changes their behavior to reduce emissions. For example, imagine an emitter was going to build a coal-fired power plant, but they decided instead to build a wind farm. This will reduce emissions every year, and they could then use those reduced emissions to offset carbon tax payments elsewhere. The problem with this type of offset is that it relies on the emitter telling the truth about what they were originally planning on doing. The emitter in this example said they were originally planning on building a coal-fired power plant, but were they really? Perhaps they intended to build a wind farm all along, but only said they were intending to build a coal-fired power plant so they could claim the carbon offsets. In other words, for an offset to count, we must be sure that the offsetting actions are in addition to what they would have done anyway, and the offsetting actions would not have occurred without the value they derive from offsetting emissions. This is known as additionality. Because of these difficulties, negotiating offset provisions can be one of the most contentious parts of any climate policy negotiations. Countries with a lot of forests, for example, may want a lot of credit for their forest removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Countries without forests, on the other hand, may wish to limit the ability for others to claim carbon offsets from forests. Solving these disagreements can take intense negotiations. Finally, we have focused almost exclusively on carbon dioxide. However, as we talked about in Chapter 6, carbon dioxide is just one of several important greenhouse gases that's driving climate change. Any effective climate policy would have to cover all of the radiative forces warming the climate. One way to do this would be to also tax all of these other greenhouse gases or require emitters to have permits to emit them. The tax rate or number of permits required would be set by how effective a greenhouse gas any particular forcer is. For example, methane is about 20 times more effective per ton of greenhouse gas. So the tax rate on a ton of methane might be set at 20 times the tax rate for a ton of carbon dioxide. And now, your moment of dog.
Come here, Casper, bring it. Good dog.